So picture this. You've got a patient sitting in your chair. Why does flipping a lens with a zero spherical equivalent magically reveal their exact astigmatism? It's a tool we use, dozens of times a day in the clinic, yet the beautiful optical physics behind it often remain a complete mystery, especially when you're first starting out. You sit down at the phoropter, you flip the dials, the patient says one or two, and eventually you get a prescription. But today, we're moving way beyond rote memorization. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to break down exactly what is happening inside the eye. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this masterclass on astigmatic refractive correction, focusing specifically on mastering the Jackson Cross cylinder. Whether you're a medical student pursuing ophthalmology, a resident gearing up for the OCAPs, or really just someone looking for a deep, intuitive understanding of the conoid of Sturm, you are in the exact right place. We're going to build a mental model here that is so strong, you'll literally never have to guess which dial to turn again. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover the Jackson Cross lens, then the circle of least confusion, determining cylinder power, combining oblique cylinders, determining the cylinder axis, and we'll wrap it all up with some high-yield OCAP and board pearls. Let's dive right in. Section 1, the Jackson Cross lens. Okay, let's contrast our two foundational strategies for astigmatic correction. With the retinoscopic approach, you're attacking the focal lines sequentially. You use your sphere to push one focal line onto the retina, and then use your cylinder to basically drag the second focal line to meet it, which collapses the conoid of Sturm. But the Jackson Cross approach, it's just so much more elegant. It attacks the focal lines simultaneously. You start by placing the circle of least confusion right on the retina, and then you use the cross cylinder to collapse the entire conoid onto that exact spot all at once. So what physically is this tool? By definition, the Jackson Cross lens is a spherocylindrical lens containing plus and minus cylinders of equal but opposite powers, and they are oriented exactly 90 degrees apart. I really want you to visualize this. If you have a plus 0.25 cylinder at axis 90, you simultaneously have a minus 0.25 cylinder at axis 180. The axes form a perfect cross. Lock that image into your mind because it is the absolute foundation of everything we're about to do. Now take a look at this number 0. Burn this into your brain because this is a massive OCAP pearl. Because those cylinders are perfectly equal and opposite, the spherical equivalent of a Jackson Cross lens is always exactly 0. And why does this clinically matter? Well, because a lens with a spherical equivalent of 0 will never move the circle of least confusion. When you flip that lens, the overall focal point stays perfectly anchored right where you put it. Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the circle of least confusion. You've probably heard this classic attending maxim on the wards: all roads must lead to mixed astigmatism. What this actually means is that before you introduce any cylinder at the phoropter, you have to use your spherical lenses to place the circle of least confusion perfectly on the retina. You absolutely must straddle the retina with your two focal lines. If that circle of least confusion is floating off in the vitreous somewhere or buried behind the macula, your cross-cylinder flips are just going to give you garbage data. So this brings us to our actual clinical workflow. Step 1. Use your sphere to anchor the circle of least confusion on the retina. Step 2. Determine the axis. And Step 3. Determine the power. Now, listen up, because here is a classic board trap. Textbooks will almost always explain power first because the physics are just simpler to draw on a page. And honestly, we'll actually do that in this very explainer. But do not confuse the textbook sequence with the clinical sequence. In the real world, in clinic, reality demands that you find the axis first. If your axis is wrong, your power adjustments will just create a whole bunch of visual chaos for the patient. All right, let's look at the physics of power. Section 3, determining cylinder power. Time for a little active recall. Think about this for a second. What happens to the conoid of Sturm when the JCC axes align perfectly with the eye's astigmatic error? Think of the conoid like an optical accordion. Got an answer? The answer is the accordion either expands or collapses. When the axes align, you are directly interacting with the eye's error. You aren't creating some new, weird oblique angles. You're simply taking the existing focal lines and either pulling them farther apart or squishing them closer together. Let's walk through what the patient is actually experiencing while you do this. At baseline, the circle of least confusion is on the retina, which gives them a baseline level of blur. If you introduce the cross and align the same signs, let's say plus over plus, you stretch that optical accordion. The focal lines move apart, the circle of least confusion gets physically larger, and the blur increases. But when you flip the lens to option B, putting opposite signs together, you collapse the conoid. The focal lines move closer together, the circle shrinks, and the patient says, "Oh wow, this one is much clearer." Eventually, when you've dialed in the exact right corrective power, flipping the lens just shifts the equal residual focal lines symmetrically back and forth. The circle size doesn't change at all, and the patient reports equal blur. And boom, that is your neutralization endpoint. And this brilliantly illustrates another major OK cap trap you have to watch out for. As you find that clearer image, you're going to add cylinder power at the phoropter. But remember, a standard cylindrical lens does not have a spherical equivalent of 0, so adding it changes the total spherical equivalent in front of the eye. This immediately knocks the circle of least confusion right off the retina. Therefore, a good rule of thumb: for every half diopter of cylinder you add, you absolutely must adjust your sphere by a quarter diopter in the opposite direction. You have to constantly push that circle of least confusion back onto the retina, or, like we said earlier, your subsequent flips will be totally worthless. Okay, let's get into the math a bit. Section 4, combining oblique cylinders. When you combine two cylinders of opposite signs that are obliquely oriented, meaning they aren't totally lined up, but they aren't perfectly 90 degrees apart either, they do something kind of magical. They spawn a brand new, resultant Jackson cross lens right there inside the patient's visual system. This new lens is oriented based on what we call the bisector angle, which is exactly halfway between the axes of the two parent cylinders. The axes of the new, resultant cross cylinder will always be found exactly 45 degrees to each side of that bisector angle. Now, if the math feels a bit abstract right now, just stick with me, because this directly dictates exactly how we find the patient's axis in our next step. Which takes us to Section 5, determining cylinder axis. So why on earth do we care about all that oblique cylinder math? Well, because when you sit down at the phoropter, your initial axis guess is almost always slightly wrong, right? Your misaligned phoropter lens and the eye's true astigmatic error lens combine obliquely. Together, they essentially create a new unwanted resultant cross cylinder. It's basically oblique astigmatism that the poor patient is now forced to look through. So we introduce our Jackson cross lens in the axis determination position, meaning it's straddling our working axis. What we're actually doing here is essentially probing that unwanted resultant cylinder we just talked about. When we flip the JCC, one position is going to align with that resultant error, stretching the focal lines and making the circle of least confusion larger and blurrier. But the flipped position will collapse those focal lines, making the circle smaller and the image much clearer. The clinical rule here is incredibly simple: chase the clear. On your phoropter, this just means rotating your axis towards the red or white dot, the plus or minus axis of the clearer choice. You just keep doing this until flipping produces symmetrical focal line shifts, which gives you that beautiful equal blur. Let's bring it all home. Section 6, OCAP and board pearls. Let's do a rapid-fire review to lock this all in. Concept 1, the spherical equivalent of a Jackson cross is always 0, and that's because it's made of equal and opposite cylinders. Concept 2, the absolute prerequisite for any of this to work is placing the circle of least confusion on the retina using your spherical lenses. Concept 3, for the axis check, you probe the oblique resultant cylinder and always rotate toward the clear choice. Concept 4, for the power check, when you add cylinder, you literally must mathematically adjust your sphere to maintain the circle of least confusion on the retina. And finally, your endpoint for both the axis and the power is equal blur on flip. That means the conoid is equally shifted and the error is completely neutralized. I want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative board-style question to test your true mastery here. Imagine you're refracting a patient. You flip the JCC, they report equal blur, you feel great about your endpoints, but the patient is still reading 20/40 on the chart. What fundamental step did you miss before you ever even touched those cylinder dials? Take a second. Got it? The answer is you forgot to put the circle of least confusion on the retina in the first place. You achieved perfect astigmatic neutralization, for sure, but you did it floating out in the vitreous somewhere instead of right on the photoreceptors. Always, always set your sphere first. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and I really hope this transforms the way you view the Jackson cross cylinder from here on out.